I'm Dan Caprio with the Providence group. Thank you very much for joining our panel on smart communities. We have a very distinguished group of panelists. And I should say at the outset, Gail Slater from the White House is unfortunately unable to be with us. She sends her regrets, but with all of the news of the week, she's gotten pulled into some other things. And so avoiding a trade war with Europe is a good use of her time. But she really did want to be here and sends her regrets. So this is a really interesting panel because we've spent a lot of time over the years at IGF and IGF USA thinking about the Internet of Things, and some of it theoretical, some of it practical. We've had lots of discussions about privacy and security. We've had lots of discussions about frameworks, and every year it kind of continues to evolve. But this year, we thought that we would sort of take it kind of to the next level and really sort of dig in on smart communities, really as an example of things that, real world examples. And so things that are happening in practice that relate to some of the difficult problems of interoperability, that relate to how do you provide privacy, how do you provide security, and so we've been able to assemble a very distinguished panel with lots of different backgrounds related to smart cities and smart communities. And so what we want to do is to be fairly informal, have a conversation give everyone a chance to talk to you a little bit about their expertise and what they're seeing, and then have a conversation among the panel, but then also open it up and have lots of time for Q&A. So with that, I think what I'll do is just introduce all the panelists at the beginning, and then we'll turn back to Eddan. So first, and this is really significant. So Eddan, we appreciate you being here, but Eddan Katz is the project lead on protocol design networks for the World Economic Forum. And so Eddan's got a lot of background in the industrial internet as it relates to smart communities, but has also participated in our work on the Internet of Things, the Dynamic Coalition at IGF itself. So thank you for taking the time to come and join us, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you. So next we have Sokwoo Rhee. Sokwoo is Associate Director of Cyber-Physical Systems at NIST and has a lot of practical experience with smart cities and the global challenge, and so we look forward to hearing more about that. And then Michelle Richardson, who's the Deputy Director of the Center for Democracy and Technology, and she also leads CDT's Freedom, Security, and Technology project. And then last but certainly not least, Jeff Brueggeman, who's Vice President, Global Public Policy with AT&T. So what I've asked all of our panelists to do is let's spend a few minutes sort of talking about your work and sort of how it relates, and then we'll come back and do a round of questions. So Eddan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you to Dan and Shane. And the IGF USA. I'm Eddan Katz. I work at the World Economic Forum. We have offices that opened up last year on the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in that, we have different projects, one on artificial intelligence and machine learning, on drones, on autonomous vehicles, and one on the Internet of Things and connected devices. And what I work on, the protocol design networks, is norm setting agreements across these different projects. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is our project on the industrial Internet of Things, that manufacturing sector, and how it onboards IoT. The Industrial Internet of Things Safety and Security Protocol was published. It's online in April, but it is an ongoing process of trying to implement a means of updating and increasing the adoption of cybersecurity best practices within the IoT space. And that's what I'm going to share with you, some of the observations about coming to some consensus and norms and what we confronted and experienced there, and some of the framework best practices that are outlined in the IoT Safety and Security Protocol. So first of all, the target audiences for this, one major part to start off with in regards to the issue of the governance is that in issuing this, we included a broad set of stakeholders, including finance and insurance. So skipping to the end, the inclusion of insurance providers throughout the process meant that the adoption of these cybersecurity practices would influence, as it's being implemented, whether or not there would be eligibility for insurance or discount. And so this is targeted with that as a policy lever in this multi-stakeholder setting, but also manufacturers, anyone who's deploying the Internet of Things in their manufacturing, and which is now increased exponentially and is a major aspect of the new means of production, but also relevant to everyone. And these best practices are not intended only to be relevant to the industrial sector, but to IoT generally. Some of the observations in regards to trying to deal with the insecurity, the vulnerabilities that are inherent in the IoT, especially as in regards to the manufacturing sector. One of the principles that really motivated what the agreement that was come across multi-stakeholders of companies, governments, civil society, academia, was the notion of the cyber-physical environment. One thing that's interesting about the IoT is connecting the data harms that can occur with vulnerabilities in cybersecurity with the physical harms. So in the industrial context, if something fails or malfunctions, someone could actually get hurt on the manufacturing floor as a result of that. So the fact that there's decentralized interconnectedness, the fact that there's an erosion of boundaries between the production and consumer space means that this is a shared responsibility. So one of the motivations and impetuses for the framing is that not one particular entity is governing, not one particular entity has control, but this is something that ought to be described as a shared responsibility. In regards to the necessity and usefulness of it being focused in part on insurance, is that the distributed risk exposure. This is one of those examples where you don't immediately sense the harm of what might happen if there was a malfunction or attack on an IoT grid. But as we've seen in some examples around the world, in the Ukraine, the electricity grid went down after a hack twice over the past few years. There could be significant damage on critical infrastructure. But that is a little bit remote. And so it's important to realize that in terms of trying to tweak incentives. And we are at a moment in time where there's uncertainty about where the liability lies and whether there's any intentionality to how it works. So one of the ways of solving the problem and trying to increase cybersecurity practices is the notion that a lot of us are familiar with, the by design, security by design. So one of the ways in which we're trying to help identify this problem and how it can be solved, given the diffuseness of it, is from incident response to harm prevention, to do the work up front. And so trying to come up with a methodology, which was what we did by policy principles that are embedded in the technological infrastructure, and understanding that there's components of it that are the information technology side, but also the operational technology side. These are older machines that weren't intended to be interconnected, legacy devices, and how do you deal with all of that? The the way in which we've gone about setting these norms is through the agile governance is the principles that we're working with, and how we are not being a governmental body nor being a standard setting organization. The World Economic Forum convenes sets of stakeholders and tries to find common understanding. And so identifying what the governance gaps, this is one, cybersecurity, in which there is lack of clarity as to how to enable adoption. Because of the fact that there's such rapid change, this has to be agile in being able to be updated and implemented. And so the World Economic Forum is trying to be a platform for this policy development. And in this context, the IoT ecosystem, the industrial IoT ecosystem, includes a wide range of entities, which is why it needs to be dealt with horizontally, from hardware makers and device manufacturers to middleware vendors and IT service providers, standards bodies. All of these are relevant. Our insight that insurance is a great lever because of the history of the impact of insurance as regulation, the modification of behavior that's enabled by shifting incentives, creating insurance, either discounts or liability rules in regards to that. The IoT protocol is sectioned into 3 different parts. There's the device safeguards, which makes recommendations about encryption and segmentation, and is patches and updating privacy, interoperability, and these are in the device safeguard section. So these are particular recommendations on the technology side. There's another whole cluster on the internal governance and risk management, and this really utilizes responsibility matrices, board oversight, deals with the fact that in order to really implement this within companies, there needs to be coordination between the business end, the IT end, and other parts of the company, and set some rules onto ongoing testing and assessment. And then finally, the last cluster of what the IoT protocol deals with is in regards to information sharing, performance indicators on record keeping and on metrics. And one of the co-chairs of the project was the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. There is a security resolution, the UN security resolution, that mandates that national governments can survey their domestic industries to find out about vulnerabilities. And so this is falling under that and moves that forward. So I just went quickly through that. I'm hoping that this provides some insight into how to deal with regulating IoT, how proposing a governance structure of coming up with these kinds of norm-setting agreements, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and answering questions when they come.
Thank you very much. Very, very good presentation. Sokwoo.
All right. So I'm going to briefly tell you about what I do at NIST, and before that, what NIST is. Probably most of you have at least heard about what it is, but you may not know what it do. And I'm going to give you a little bit brief history of what happened to smart city and IoT for the last 2 decades, and why we are here, and why we're talking about cybersecurity and privacy issues as of today. So NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology. We are part of, we are essentially R&D bureau of U.S. Department of Commerce. So we do a lot of standards, obviously, but we do a lot more than standards. We do measurement science, and standard can cover a lot of different things. It could cover physical science, it could be chemistry, it could cover cybersecurity, and all the way up to ITs and emerging technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence. My job at NIST is a little unique in a sense that I work on more of the innovation side. So my title is Associate Director of Innovation for Cyber Physical Systems, and my job is ecosystem development, community engagement, and prototyping, and pilots, and collaboration with the industry and academia to create momentum in the market that will eventually end up with the setting standards and best practices. So you may think it's a little weird because, hey, why doesn't NIST just go out and dictate standards? That's not how it works. We can write 300-page documents all the way we want, but if industry and anybody, users do not take it and use it, it's just a piece of junk, right? So that's not how I want to do it. We want to create consensus in the industry and the market. And market has to drive the standard. We want to help them accelerate the process. That's what I do. And that's what I do. My portfolio includes Internet of Things and smart cities in general. Those two are not separate. Internet of Things, usually you have 3 different categories. One is a consumer IoT, the other one is more the industrial IoT that Eddan talked about. Third one is a public sector application. So if you apply IoT concept to smart city and municipal environment, that becomes a smart city. We started, IoT is not new, by the way. It's been around for decades, multiple decades with different names. There was M2M, they called it like machine to machine, and they called it device network and all that. And about 20 years ago, the term IoT was coined out of the Auto ID Center in MIT. And then Sanjay Sharma and Kevin Ashton basically came out with it. And then early 2000 was essentially a renaissance of IoT. That's where all this academic research that was going on with the sensor technologies and wireless connectivity started to come into industry. So there was a bunch of new startups that came out of that. There's Dust Network and Millennial Net and Ember Network, and those kind of early pioneers on that. And then there was a huge excitement and billions of dollars got invested into IoT, and then went into Ice Age, starting from about 2006, roughly. The problem was, a lot of, including myself, I was the founder of one of those companies at the beginning. And then the problem was we invested a lot of money in developing technologies, sensors, protocols, and cloud system, and all that, without clear understanding about what are you going to actually do with it. Oh, we just threw in sensors, like hundreds of out there, and somebody's going to pay money for it? Well, we thought so. That wasn't exactly the case. So back in around 2012, about 5 years ago, I was brought into the US government to work on IoT as a presidential innovation fellow. And then what we wanted to do was work with the industry. Specifically, one of the examples was Industry Internet Consortium, led by AT&T is here, and GE, and Intel, and now it's grown into one of the largest ecosystem for industry internet. About, I think, 250 members around the world. And our job was to work with them and create the market momentum with a specific goal to create the real-world applications that can create real value. Because from the experience of early 2000, we clearly understood technology for the technology's sake was not going to cut it. So I worked on it, and then for about a year, and then IIC, which is Internet Consortium, took off and is doing a great job still. We started looking into public sector because at that time we started believing that cities and municipal government is one of the places that is sort of lagging in terms of adopting a lot of these emerging technologies, what they call. And IoT, we believe that clearly could help to improve the quality of life of every day. Transportation, public safety, utility, water, and wireless, and even agriculture in rural areas. There are so many different applications that we see that municipal government could adopt these emerging technologies and make a quantum leap in their service. Now, so that's the background. So I've been running a program called the Global City Teams Challenge at NIST for the last 4 years now. And that is essentially a collaboration program and incubation and nurturing new technologies and new projects, specifically focused on the measurable benefits, that's what it called. One of the problems that we saw, and quickly saw in the municipal government in applying IoT technologies is so fragmented. It's not just a municipal government problem, it's an IoT problem in general. But the definition of fragmentation in municipal government is a little different. It's a siloed process, meaning one city invests millions of dollars to come up with a traffic congestion management system, all right? And another city, which is probably only 50 miles away, invests another millions of dollars to do the same thing, and eventually after 3 years of R&D and development, they come with basically the same solution. And by the way, they sometimes use the same vendors as well. So, point is, here's the problem. if you want to see any emerging technologies to take the market share, and you really need to create some kind of hockey stick. You really need to see, not just from the technology perspective, from business perspective, you need to see exponential growth in the market. And that cannot happen if you develop, keep developing, basically inventing the wheel over and over again. You have to develop new things on top of whatever exists today. That's the way to create this hockey stick. IoT and smart city, as of today, well, even today, even after 4 years of work that we have been putting through, is still not satisfactorily, has not achieved that point yet. But we are getting there. Now, however, in this Global City Teams Challenge Program, which is a collaboration between NIST and multiple federal agencies, including National Science Foundation, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, and NTIA, ISA, ITA, so on, in collaboration with about 200 cities around the world and about 400 companies, universities, nonprofits around the world. We have created about around 180 projects, what we call action clusters. Those are the ones that collaboration between the public and private. They come with the projects, and our job is to identify and nurture what we call replicable deployments. We are a firm believer that if a technology is good for only one city, that's great for that city. There's no two ways about it. But that's not going. If that does not replicate to other cities, frankly, we cannot create this hockey stick at all. All right. So our job at NIST is to identify those replicable technologies, and hopefully that can become best practices, and eventually lead to standards. Now, so we successfully created this market movement. 5 years ago, in the US, there was very little talk about smart cities. In Europe, there was a lot of talk about smart cities, in Asia as well. But the US was a little lagging. Today, we all talk about smart city. Nobody even asks what that is anymore, because we all know sort of what that is. And I will just briefly, funny story. 5 years ago, 4 years ago, when I started the smart city thing, I was in one of the panels, and somebody raised a hand and said, hey, do you think that transportation is part of smart city? He doesn't think so, because transportation is separate. Now, today's view, that's a stupid question, because without transportation, you talk about smart city? No way, right? But that was like that 4 or 5 years ago. Today, we don't ask that question anymore. So we believe we successfully created with the partners and everything, not just us, but with the collaboration with everybody, create successful understanding and momentum in the market. Here's the problem. Now we are seeing there are a lot of pilots and moving into deployments. A lot of them are not necessarily ready for security and privacy issues. And we are seeing this for the last couple of years. Well, it exists. These risks existed in theory for a long time. But now we are seeing real examples of how these things could actually hurt us. So here's the thing. In traditional IT system, if you don't have a lot of cybersecurity and privacy measures, then what you lose is your emails and your credit card numbers, which is bad. I'm not saying that's good. But in smart city, in cyber physical systems and IoT, if your cyber system is penetrated, then somebody might die. Right? That's the difference here. All right. So this year, the Global City Teams Challenge has specifically focusing on identifying, again, the best practices of cybersecurity and privacy, specifically on the smart city, smart community area. What we have found out so far is this. This is funny. I talked to a lot of city folks, including mayors and all those, and I sit down with them and say, so what is your top 3 concerns in your city in terms of smart city today? And a lot of answers come, but usually something about security and privacy comes out in one of those 3 to 5. So awareness is there. Everybody knows in the cities that this is an important thing. And my next question goes to, okay, so what are you actually doing for that? Is it, then hand waving starts. Well, there is a company that we buy products that has something there that we don't know about. That's the level of response we get, which means there's really no comprehensive understanding and policy and framework in place that cities can take and use. It's not necessarily lack of technology. It's more of a resource issue, sometimes a bandwidth issue, sometimes it's a guideline issue. I'm seeing good signs here and there. There are several cities that started hiring what they call CISO, Chief Information Security Officers, in addition to CIOs and CTOs, of course. And New York City, for example, started coming up with guidelines for cybersecurity and privacy specifically for smart city area. They started this work about a couple of years ago, and they even came up with a draft. But there are a very small number of cities in the world that can afford to even come up with their own guidelines. It's just, they don't have a level of expertise, all right? We have 19,000 cities and local governments in the United States, 19,000, all right? Only probably 5 or less than 5% of them have enough resources to come up with the comprehensive guideline and for the cybersecurity and privacy for smart cities. So we need a different approach. And by the way, federal government can help, but there are 19,000 local governments. We cannot fund them all. That's basically impossible for us to do it. So you need to create a market momentum. You need to create a virtuous circle in the market that can almost like organically be able to create consensus and best practice for that. And that's what they're shooting for. Maybe, sorry, I talked too much. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background and what I do and set the tone for at least for my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion. You've given us lots of food for thought and lots of things that we can come back to. So, Michelle, having heard that,
Yeah, well,
so over to you.
well, I have to say, city IoT is one of my favorite uses, and I think it has some of the biggest risks, but also some of the best potential for influencing both privacy and security practices. And we have to start from recognizing that government actors are just different, right? They're different from the private sector. They have very different responsibilities in the ecosystem of what they owe citizens, right? We can't opt out of our government. You may be able to choose a different product or a different service if you don't like it or if there's a mistake. But we're stuck with our governments, right? There's only one way to get your water, only certain streets you can drive on. And so the stakes are much higher when there's a failure at the government level. That responsibility to the public, too, is about a smart use of their tax dollars, right? How important it is to get these systems right on the front end. How long it takes to change government systems, right? They can be notoriously slow. They can't always turn on a dime like some of the rest of the tech industry. So they might be stuck with what they purchase and set up for a very long time and have a very hard time fixing it if there are mistakes. And then there are constitutional issues, right? When the government collects information, it's not just about statutes, and there are very few that are going to govern this information, but it's about the Constitution itself. And actually, we just had a huge change in the last few weeks with the Supreme Court case that is going to probably revolutionize the types of information that can be collected and the process of how to get it. Just a little background on that. Usually, the legal system says that if you do something in public, you don't have an expectation of privacy, right? So the government does not have to go get a warrant to track you. And basically, by participating in the public sphere, you're foregoing your right to privacy. And that had been the rule for many decades until just a couple of weeks ago. And there was a case about cell phone tracking. So there was a robbery, and they didn't get a warrant, but police got 4 months of the cell site location from the phone company, right? And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said, no, you had to get a warrant. And beautiful quotes about you don't lose your Fourth Amendment rights when you step outside of your front door. There are things that are even unreasonable in the public space, and there are times where the government does have to afford you privacy rights. And they looked at things like the nature of the information, right? They found location to be uniquely sensitive and revealing of persons' behavior and beliefs and associations, and the volume of information. And finally, they looked at whether you can meaningfully opt out of using the technology. So to the extent that the government is going to be collecting this data and it might reflect personal information, those are the types of questions that you're going to have to ask, especially if you want to share it with law enforcement or other parts of the government. The other exciting thing, though, too, about government IoT is that it does have the ability to really influence the market. So we're hoping that if these best practices, both on privacy and security, are adopted at the city level, it's going to raise all boats. Especially we're concerned about the consumer sector. There are things that happen in the industrial space because they're regulated, right? For other reasons. Cities are accountable, but we're seeing consumer devices are kind of just out of control. And so we're hoping that this will actually influence, to the extent that sometimes these cities are buying consumer off-the-shelf products or are making traditional security and privacy controls more widely accepted. The types of things we should be asking about when we want to consider the types of IoT that the government is incorporating into its systems. So the basic question is what personal information is collected and for what purpose is it going to be used? I find that often people will talk about city IoT in sensors, right? They say so many of the things we buy don't collect personal information. The temperature is this point, so you have to turn on the air conditioning, right? This is how many cars go through the intersection. And that's great. You might need different privacy rules for that, or maybe none at all. But there is going to be a subset that will collect personal information. And the question is whether that information should be collected at all, what it's going to be used for, and whether the value trade there is there. There might be times when you actually might look at it and say, this is actually a very simple process that we could do with real people in real time that doesn't collect the same information, so we'll forgo an IoT device or connected process. And the usual questions on data minimization, like how long information will be kept, who is going to have access to it. We're also seeing cities trying to make the information publicly available so researchers can use it to find things out about populations and offer better services. But that kind of gets us into the 2018 problems, right, of privacy. We're finding that even aggregate data released can reveal some important things. Maybe not an individual person, but like we saw in the Strava case, right? When they released information with heat maps of their activity trackers, they revealed the location of a military base overseas. And you could see where everybody walked and actually outlined the military base, right? So there is risks in releasing aggregate data too. And I think we also need to think about artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think we've seen a lot in the last year or two about how we think about this as not being a fix for everything. At the beginning, we thought, well, this is sort of a value-neutral way to make decisions based on objective information. And what we're finding is a lot of times this actually just doubles down on disparities that already exist in cities. Examples you often see are in the law enforcement space, right? So information where you base where you want to send your police officers on live time data about where crime happens. The first time they rolled it out, it just sent them right back to the police station, because that's where all the criminals are in the city, right? But when they rolled it out again, they found it going back to the same neighborhoods, and meaning the same people were being arrested, which fed the same information back into the system, right? And so it actually exacerbated problems. It wasn't a neutral actor at all. I think we need to also think about how we're going to involve the public on the front end. I think what we've seen in places like Seattle is an upset that the technology was rolled out before there was a full public discussion and people truly understood what was at stake. And they were able to course correct, but they had to put things on hold, go back, spend a couple of years talking to citizens. And city governments are very different, right? It is incredibly hard to change policy at the federal level or sometimes even the state level, but our city decision makers are really accountable to local people. And that's how we've seen the move in advocacy on the privacy in this area move from the federal level to locals. People are learning pretty quickly that your city council member is very easy to reach, and they're actually very easy to remove if they make bad decisions. And so they're just much more responsive. And to that extent, you need to involve people on the front end. I find that usually everyone has the word privacy in their policies, right? We're going to respect privacy. But that's pretty much the end of the agreement. What privacy means very quickly gets complicated. Yep. And a huge amount of time is being spent trying to convince people that their ideas of privacy are wrong. This is not just governments, but companies. It's an incredible effort to say, gosh, that's silly, don't worry about it. Instead, we should be recognizing that privacy values are changing quick, and sometimes we can't always see what's going to resonate with people in advance. I think it's something we can learn from the Cambridge Analytica debacle over the last year. That information had been public for actually several years, but someone finally presented it to people in a way that really resonated with them and has kicked up a privacy debate and possibility for legislation here in DC that we've just never seen before. So there's always going to be that gap between what people understand and how they feel about it. And if you get on the front end of the process by including citizens, explaining to them how it's actually going to work, and respecting their concerns, we're going to be able to minimize the fallout over the long term. To the extent that we want to convince people that they don't have privacy rights in public, that is just not how people feel about it. It's really interesting. We often work on high-tech issues with, internet records, right? Cell site location. But if you look at the privacy laws over the last 15 years that states and localities have passed, they have been about drones, license plate readers, red light cameras, and things that are in the public sphere. And these are the things that do raise very sincere concerns for people. And they are going to only continue to the extent that we put out more devices that are collecting information. I think the great thing, though, is that we can be responsive to these concerns. A lot of the privacy engineering principles that NIST has been putting out will address a lot of these concerns, right? To make sure you're only collecting the information you need, that there's a good reason for it, that it is destroyed when it's no longer necessary, and really including people on the front end. And I think that's going to solve a lot of our problems to the extent that privacy is being a hurdle to the adoption of IoT in cities.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Jeff.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Yep.
And I do want to start by noting that I really do think we're seeing a lot of momentum behind these smart communities, and the technology has been emerging for a while, and to some extent is, as others have said, is really just reusing Internet of Things technology that is already being deployed. But it has taken a little while for cities to get to this point. At AT&T, we provide connectivity for a full range of Internet of Things devices, whether it's health monitoring, drones, connected cars, and we have a division dedicated to smart communities. And so I do want to talk a little bit about, I think, how some cities are successfully managing some of the issues that we're talking about today, because I think we really are seeing progress being made in some of these areas. We have worked with 7 cities on pilot projects. As Sokwoo said, I think part of the idea here is to give some good examples out in the real world to show others how it can be done and to kind of set a good template. So we thought that by focusing with some partners and really pulling together all of the threads of what Internet of Things can do for a community, that would help to really show the value and also show how these issues can be managed successfully. And I think a common theme of all of my fellow panelists has been these issues cut across horizontally. And so if you're going to really deal with Internet of Things in a smart, strategic way, you've got to think comprehensively across the individual vertical silos. And it really is no different than the way a company would deal with this. So your chief technologist, you don't want to have the water department separate from transportation, separate from your public safety. You really want to think about how can we use the same Internet of Things devices to serve all of those needs. And increasingly, the technology is there to do that. So you can have a device on a lamppost that provides Wi-Fi, tracks pedestrian and car traffic, and possibly listens for gunshots, right? Something like that. And they even have a video camera with it. So you don't have to deploy 4 different types of devices in 4 different departments of your community to get the benefits of that. And then what we see is we have begun offering a Smart Cities Operations Center to try to pull together the data from all those different places into one. And Miami-Dade County is actually one of the leaders in deploying that. So just like in a company, you want to have full visibility of the data across your network and the devices. And that's going to not only give you the benefits of thinking about new, interesting ways to use that information, right? So I may want to know for traffic planning what the traffic patterns are, but I can now give citizens of my city much better real-time data about traffic and adjust traffic lights automatically to help improve their situation or reroute buses in a way that is serving the needs of the community better. So there's the sum is greater than the individual parts once you start to pull all this data together. But obviously, that's also going to have huge security and privacy benefits, as Michelle and Eddan were talking about. You can't secure what what you're not aware of. So you need to have a chief security officer type who can look across all of the data that you're collecting and think about. We call it defense in depth. You got to think about securing the devices. You have to think about securing the connectivity, and you have to secure any information that you collect. And the good news is, because the public sector has somewhat lagged here, there are services and technologies that are on the market. So, what I would say is this isn't a technology issue so much as a governance and a financial issue. Is there someone in the community thinking about these issues and prioritizing it so that it gets built into the plan from the beginning? And the concern that we always see is if you try to pick the cheapest option, usually that's the one with very poor, little to no security. And that's the same at home, but also applies at the level of a smart community. So having a commitment to security from the beginning and building that in is going to be really important. And then I completely agree with privacy. I think it's the same way. And we do see some cities really trying to be proactive about this. And a recent example is the city of Portland. We are part of a consortium with GE and Intel to deploy smart lighting devices throughout the city, but they also wanted to use that to track pedestrian and auto traffic and reduce injuries and fatalities in that area. And the city decided they could do that without collecting any of the actual data. So they, we have the devices can store video if you want to do that, but they decided we want to do real-time analysis at the device level. Don't even send the video over the network. And we were able to build that for them. So to Michelle's point, they're kind of minimizing the data up front because they made a strategic decision that the cost didn't outweigh the benefits didn't outweigh the cost there. So I think, again, the technology is there. It's flexible. You can, there are controls and decisions that can be made about what data you collect, how you collect it, and how you use it. But somebody's got to be thinking about that up front. And then I think Seattle is an interesting example, too, because, while they had some issues initially, they ended up working with the Future Privacy Forum. And what I think is very forward-looking kind of privacy plan for open records. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it asks all the questions that you need to think through in terms of, what am I collecting? What data would be made available? What happens? What are the privacy risks, as you said, of once you have a public data set of it being able to be combined against others? But that's a really new issue for someone in city municipal government to be thinking about. And one of the challenges with Internet of Things that we see is that it's basically creating every sector of the economy is becoming involved in IT, right, or ICT. And that means they all have to worry about privacy and security in a way that they haven't before. And so that's going to be, I think, maybe part of the smart cities challenge is not just the technology and how do you have the right program, but how do we get people who are educated and capable of doing these things and work with the communities to deal with these issues. But I'd say we've seen a lot of progress, and as these pilot projects continue, I think that'll be an opportunity to really set a template that can be used by others to show that there are solutions here.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think there's a lot of common themes of, what I'm hearing, sort of best practices, risk management, scale, and a couple of others. But, and I wanted to go back to you. You started off and mentioned agile governance, and I think Jeff just alluded to it as well. But and you highlighted in one of your categories in terms of governance, risk management. So how, in your framework, or as you're thinking about this, what do you, and I think we've heard from others, there's sort of an enterprise risk issue here. How do you, or at WEF, how do you think about risk management as it relates to the industrial IoT or smart cities? Is there a better or worse way to communicate that? Because that's the beauty of the NIST cybersecurity framework, to sort of think of it strategically. And I think it's something that, you know, we all need to give a little more thought to.
Well, in one part, in regards to the IoT protocol, one aspect of dealing with the risk management is to see it not as, you know, one part of the story, but that it exists in different aspects. So the document is sectioned off into, as I mentioned, a device safeguards part, which are, you know, technical rules that you'd want to have employed beforehand, the security by design relevant to that. But also it has to do with internal governance and what the corporate structure is and who's responsible and laying it out and having a process. And so it involves that as well. It isn't just about devices. And then finally, a more collective notion of sharing information and being able to leverage that information generally, and outside of, most significantly, outside of any individual entity, to collectively be able to understand trends and to be able to be aware of vulnerabilities and be able to address them in that way. So one thing in regards to risk management and agile governance as we're thinking about it is to understand that there isn't just one aspect of it being about technological specifications or about principles or about operating procedures, but that it's a combination of all these things is one aspect of that. The other aspect of that's relevant here in regards to risk management is engaging the insurance industry directly. Cyber risk insurance is now fastly developing, very quickly developing, not only in the ability to offer liability and protection products, but also as a service along the way of being able to assess and audit risks beforehand, either through the insurance companies themselves or through entities such as the Industrial Internet Consortium and their membership, and this document is actually housed with them as well. We also, you know, have worked with under UL to try to get this to be something that is ongoing, I think, in terms of risk management, rather than just be after the fact, is to address this as it's unfolding. So those are some aspects of how to think about it, but overall, I would say that in regards to the process that we're engaged with, and in particular, if there's something about the World Economic Forum and how we're going about this protocol design, is for it to be truly multi-stakeholder, for it to engage the different concerns, both in the short term and the long term, the economic and the social, have those aired out and be part of a process that really enables agreement and cooperation. And so thinking through, given the complexity and the wide breadth, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the remoteness of some of the harm, even though it's great, it does require there to be some structures to focus on how to deal with the risk management.
Right. Do you find this as a conversation within WEF itself? So among your CEOs and board members or members, are you beginning to have the conversation at that level, or how much concern is it that they have about or understanding of sort of how to frame and manage risk?
Right. So part of that is that bringing the group together, understanding that some of the concerns from each of the industries, this is a classic collective action problem. So each of the different sectors and industries, and it is not entirely within their capacity to solve this problem, and it has to be done together. So bringing them together and airing it out in a way that leverages some of the levers that can be pushed on the economic end on devices, I think that helps share the shared responsibility point I was trying to make about that being something that is very much appreciated. So not only is there guidance, in the example, in the IoT protocol example, some of the manufacturers of software have dealt with cybersecurity a lot and are accustomed to the debate. But manufacturers who have not been a part of cybersecurity discussions before usually relegate it to the IT department. And part of what we're saying, and part of the agreement, part of what was understood, is that this has to be shared across different parts of the company. So that helped lead along. In the cyber risk insurance, even though this relies on them, there's also looking for some guidance and how to piece this together, these are new. The actuarial science isn't fully determined on it. So being able to do it in a cross-sector way, in a discussion that tries to find points of agreement, I think is a key part of being able to address the risk management in a way that's non-threatening and also something that can lead to actual implementation. So the conversation doesn't just end, as far as our initiatives are concerned, with the publication of this document, but through the implementation and then long-term stability of its relevance with entities such as the IIC shepherding that long-term sustainability.
Right, and IGF.
And IGF, of course.
So, Sokwoo, you mentioned, I knew there were a lot of municipalities and local governments, but 19,000, that's a lot.
That's roughly the number.
And so you also mentioned sort of scale and best practices and your global city team challenges. So and you highlighted New York City. Are there other, or mentioned New York City, are there others, or sort of in terms of boots on the ground, kind of what's happening in practice? And you're honest and said, look, this just has been a little slow to adopt. But in terms of, are you optimistic that so New York's doing its thing, but optimistic that others are beginning to kind of lead the way that's going to lead to best practices and scale? And so, if so, kind of name names.
Yeah. So, yeah, of course. So the New York City was just one of the examples, one of the 200 cities. So there are many other examples that I can think of, starting from the large cities like that, LA, San Francisco, and believe it or not, Washington, D.C. has a lot of smart city projects going on. Maybe you don't even perceive it. You don't even notice it. If you go out, smart parking solutions, public Wi-Fi solutions, street lighting is out there. And Portland is, AT&T, Jeff mentioned, is one of the probably leading cities in terms of try to push this forward. So there are two different things. There is where the cities that are on the level more advanced already, the cities that are trying to get there and going fast and furious right now. And Portland is one of the cities that's going really fast and furious. Kansas City, and it comes down to sort of like their leadership as well. Kansas City has a CIO which is extremely energetic, and he is like a superstar. And just himself put together a coalition of multiple large companies and essentially turned one of the corridors in Kansas City into a test bed. And they brought in over 10 companies to install their best practices over there, which show the real impact, and convinced the city council to issue an RFP with a citywide deployment of this type of solution. So that's an example that a change maker, a change agent, could actually really make a difference. And it's not just about these large scale or even middle scale cities. How many of you heard about a city called Winooski, Vermont? Winooski. Okay, a few. That's a relatively small city. It's in Vermont. It's about 12,000 people. But what they do is they actually installing sensors underground in their in the water underground system to monitor the effectiveness and the wear and tear of the pipes. So that's a great example of how smart city can actually save actual money, because otherwise city has to actually dig the ground and replace the pipes, right? Without even knowing how much damage that's done to the pipes. So another example is Ammon, Idaho. Raise your hands. Great. Again, it's about 10,000. They have a shotgun detection technology. They developed it with, obviously, not city itself, but with the companies. So the point is, it's not just example for large cities. There are a lot of smaller cities and towns and counties, and they're developing these technologies. And the point is, again, goes back to scalability. Having one city, one town developing these things is interesting. But what are the really shared problems that many of these cities and towns and communities can employ and adopt, either standards or best practices? One of the problems that Portland is also leading at the same time with Austin and other cities is what they call first mile and last mile problem. And Greenville, South Carolina, again, it's a small town. They are actually part of this sort of what you call a smart shuttle. They don't call it consortium, but that's sort of like a group of these cities trying to tackle the same problem. Principle, first mile, last mile is when there is a public transportation bus stops, they're a couple of miles away in many areas of the suburban area. So if you want to commute using those public transportation, you still have to walk a couple of miles a day or more just to get to bus stations and come back and forth. That's a lot of miles if you think about it. So how do you fill the gap of last mile? And New York City doesn't have this problem. I mean, you have a lot of subway stations. But there are many towns and suburban areas in the United States that becomes a huge problem. And that's the kind of shared problems that these cities can get together and solve. So I can go on and give you all this information about more cities, but I will stop here.
I have a question though, because it spurred a thought. Who is the repository of these examples of scale or best practices? Because you mentioned rightly so, you can't just do these one-off. You can't just do one, you can't just do onesies and twosies. You got to really get to scale. So
right.
Who's providing the directory or the repository, or is that something that is a specific need?
Yeah, so it's unfortunately is as fragmented as the installation themselves. So meaning there are a lot of bodies out there, nonprofits. They have like tens or 20s, dozens of these repositories, and GCTC has our own repository as a wiki. So we publish all the information on the wiki. That now is under development, but we're about halfway through to catalog all this project for the last 3 years. The problem is you can publish whatever you want. You can document whatever you want. But at the end of the day, that's not what cities are looking for. Cities are looking for what has been successful for their cities. And they want to understand which types of projects really worked, which solutions has worked. So you need more of a historical perspective instead of a snapshot, and see if over the course of the last 3 years, this project has generated this amount of impact. And plus, one of the metrics of success for me is how many cities, number of cities that actually share the same solution or same approach. That's the metric of success. That's what you're trying to do, but to answer your question, there's no single repository that has all this. Everybody comes with a snapshot, but you really need to have a time series of this, and that's tough.
It sounds like there's a real need.
Yes.
Interesting. Michelle, I'm glad you mentioned Seattle and kind of made the point about involving people in the front end or on the front end. So for those that are less familiar with Seattle, talk a little bit about, some of the lessons learned, and they think the lessons learned in Seattle were more related to privacy than security, but I think they got a little ahead of themselves and then had to reel it back. But what are some things that as we're thinking about this that people need to keep in mind?
Yeah, well, I think it's an example of what we're going through with the private sector right now, that there's a big difference between can and should, right? Our laws, both in the private sector and in the government, have been static for decades, right? They're incredibly permissive. And so a lot of these decisions are within the government's judgment, right, of whether to put these programs out there. And we see that there are certain types of technology or information that people that are especially upset about. And video recording is one of them, right? Especially if it's married with something that seemed to be sort of a high-tech accelerator, like facial recognition, for example, right? Marrying not just that you're scanning people's faces, but with some way you're trying to sort them and make decisions about them that people feel very uncomfortable with. We see that this sort of recording, visual sort of recording people, or even the sound, is particularly upsetting to people. And that was the case in Seattle. And I think it's also a good example, though, that if you include people, they can be reasonable, right? They came to something more reasonable in that situation. And I don't know if you've ever sat through some of these community meetings. I've done that on things, everything from police body cameras, racial profiling, and people really do want a solution. They want meaningful information. They want to be part of the decision-making process, and they understand weighing the services that they're going to get in return, right? But they want to be part of that process because they are the ones being served, right? They're the client, not the government, not the companies. It is about the people, right? This is our topic here, is how do we make these people-centric? And if they're not involved on the front end, they're just not going to be responsive to people's genuine concerns.
Right. Very good advice. So, Jeff, I want to turn to you for a second. Kind of two questions. You mentioned connectivity. And I know Gail was going to talk about 5G and the importance of 5G. So if you could give a little background on that. And then the other question is kind of similar to the question I asked Sokwoo. Talk a little bit more about some of your pilots. You mentioned Portland, but what are some of the lessons learned in the other pilots, especially if there's not? I know a lot of this is organic, but if there's not a repository, what are the lessons learned from some of your pilots? So, two questions.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, what your first
5G.
question was about 5G, right? So, 5G is, we've announced, I think we're going to do at least a dozen cities this year. So 5G is coming. It's a new technology that's going to provide much faster speeds, but also much lower latency. And so for things like connected cars and drones that need instantaneous, reliable connections, it's going to be a real facilitator for those types of things. So in the smart community context, if you're going to have smart infrastructure that facilitates connected cars, right? So the car is not only communicating with each other, but also communicating with sensors in the road itself to avoid accidents and provide the navigation. 5G is going to be a great enabler of that. But also think about public safety, real-time video for police or firefighters. Those are the types of things that 5G would be really well equipped for. However, we also need to deploy much smaller cell sites in order to enable 5G, so that density is important. So the linkage to me of smart communities is that demand that the community can help pull 5G in, but cities can also do a lot by just lowering the barriers to make it easier to get permits to deploy these smart cells, and we can use some of the same, as I said earlier, some of the same multi-use infrastructure. If you're doing smart, you can deploy this on the lamppost with other sensors and other things at the same time. So there are a lot of synergies that can be gained here, but ultimately, 5G is going to be one of the great enablers for smart communities. And I should also mention the FirstNet network, which is being rolled out, which is kind of a nationwide public safety network that AT&T is building and going to operate. Again, I think that so far has been kind of separate from what we have seen with smart communities, but to me really is one of the main things that should be integrated in a community plan, is to think about how public safety is going to benefit from all the other information that's being deployed.
Good.
Yeah. And in terms of other cities, I was thinking about, Sokwoo, your comment that transportation isn't part of smart cities is very funny, because that's
5 years ago,
probably
4 years
the the application that we're seeing the most.
Exactly, that's my point.
You're right. So right here in this area, we are working with Montgomery County, and they wanted to do enhancements to the bus service in Montgomery County, offer Wi-Fi hotspots and better transportation information to the users. And that's kind of one of the themes that we hear from the mayors and political leaders in communities is, cost savings are fine, but if I can't show to my citizens and the voters what they're getting out of these smart communities, then this is going to be an uphill challenge. So I think things like Wi-Fi kiosks or providing better transportation information to the community, you need to show them the value. And it's kind of to Michelle's point. I mean, they need to kind of see that they're getting something out of this too. And there is a lot that they have to gain. But I think the cities that are really trying to think about how to make this, kind of the citizen engagement actually being one of the planks of their plan, I think are going to be more successful.
Great. Thank you. Well, we could continue talking among ourselves, but I want to open it up and take your questions. So right here in the front, but I think microphone, and please identify yourself. And then we'll go back to you. But
question, I think, primarily for Gabe Goldberg, freelance technology writer, for Mr. Katz and Mr. Rhee. The question regards the intersection of Internet of Things and the right to repair. And there have been talks about farmers that might have a $300,000 tractor that's controlled by software. And if there's a problem, they may wait for 2 weeks for the John Deere tech to come and work on it, and they can't fix it. If you have a smart city where the entire traffic grid is being controlled by technology, and between copyright law and Digital Millennium Copyright Act prohibits the city from actually working on the network until the vendor can come and get around to fixing it, there's a real problem. Internet of Things can be manufacturing, multi-million-dollar assemblies, they can be tractors, they can be consumer devices. If there's no right to repair it, then people are at the mercy of the manufacturer. If you look at the difference between Android phones and Apple phones, Apple pushes the updates when they know there's a security risk. If you have an Android phone, the Android fix has to go to your carrier, the carrier has to bless it and decide to propagate it. That can take a long time. How about the Internet of Things and the right of repair? There seems to be a pretty urgent requirement for people to be able to fix their own manufacturing facility, tractors, or home devices.
So thank you for that question. I think that's an insightful point. I think that is a large part of why transparency of the process is something that at least the IoT protocol that we were working on at many different levels is important, and that the fact that it is a set of companies and a set of entities made it so that the norms that we were addressing were more generally applicable and would lean towards transparency solutions as being the best means by which to improve cybersecurity best practices. So I would say, in regards to good policy, the ability to support the ability for the right to repair is an important aspect of maintaining long-term cybersecurity. I think in regards to your question on anti-circumvention provisions, the way that 1201 works is that there are every few years exceptions that get taken up, and I think right to repair is prime on the list of those that need to be discussed and openly addressed to enable that kind of right to repair, and that when it's a black box, it endangers cybersecurity rather than help solve anything.
So I'm going to just add one point from technical perspective. What you mentioned is essentially upgradability. That's how we call it, and very much technically, that's really a firmware upgrade. Now, as it may sound easy, because you do that all the time with the iPhone and Android phones, when it comes down to a small device, which is $5 per pop, that is not an easy technology. And as of today, doing this firmware upgrade constantly with limited power sources and a limited memory footprint, believe it or not, there's not really easy way to do that. So coming down, the tractor is a fairly large device that's probably going to be worth it. But there will be probably millions and billions and zillions of smaller devices that are going to be spread around in your home and your city and going around. Still, it's not very well understood, or it's not very well agreed on how we're going to actually implement this upgradability in all those devices. Yeah. So that's technical hurdle that we have to get through.
And I'll add, something that we see now in more voluntary standards and international standards is that devices where the connectivity is sort of like a monitoring function or a value added, that it operates without the connection. So I'm thinking of something like, I can't remember the city, but recently their stoplights were hacked, right? Because they were connected traffic lights. That would be an example of something that even if the online capacity failed, you would still be able to control it and it would work in some way. And it seems like that would actually be especially important to some of these city systems that have real physical consequences and offer services that aren't going to work otherwise.
Great.
Question back here.
Thank you. Monique Tate with the Equitable Internet Initiative, so I'll forewarn you that you're talking to a community activist is speaking.
Speak up a little bit.
Can you speak?
Oh, okay. Do you need me to repeat my name? I said Monique Tate with the Equitable Internet Initiative, and I'll forewarn you that I'm speaking from a community activist perspective. Michelle spoke to it quite a bit, and I enjoyed hearing that, because the people-centric part is what I was focusing, or what I'm focusing on. I want to understand how you really are trying to relate to the community, relevant to rolling out smart city technology, because if you're talking about 5G and it's going to be rolled out, I'm presuming that's over an existing network, and that's where there's already a lot of Wi-Fi, but where people who are excluded and don't have Wi-Fi access or feel manipulated because if they're being over-policed, and of course rejecting a lot of the surveillance things that are going on, but what community engagement is actually occurring so that perhaps conversations can be made where, if you're going to say, for instance, the traffic lights, of course they're everywhere, as well as street lights. We know they could emit Wi-Fi and increase access for various neighborhoods and be a combination of creating both a smart city and a better connected city. So how are you really engaging in communities? I don't care who answers that.
Who wants to take that?
I'll jump in and
Yeah.
just reiterate what Michelle said, is I think cities need to figure out how to do this. My dad was a city planner, and I grew up watching him on the monthly housing meetings get yelled at, for very minor things about where a light was, a street light was or something. And I think these data issues are incredibly important, but our cities aren't necessarily designed to get that community engagement. I think, as you said, Seattle learned the hard way, but maybe the lesson learned is, you need to bring people in early, as you said, and have a plan yourself for, I need to think about what data I'm collecting, what the impact could be, and then I need to find a way to convey that to the citizens and get input on it. So I think that's another example of how this is a data management issue that is much different than what a city has traditionally dealt with, and it needs to find a way to engage with people on it. I see the same thing with student privacy in schools, right? Technology is a great enabler, but parents are incredibly concerned, and I think where we've had issues is where parents feel like they don't know what's happening, they don't have any input or control into it, and that has caused a huge backlash sometimes. And I think a lot of that can be avoided if there's kind of a process up front to get that input. I think your point was so important about people are part of the process, they feel much more vested in the outcome than if they don't know what's happening, they're going to be much more critical. So.
And one way that some communities have forced this is they've made it mandatory by basically passing local regulations that say before the city or county can purchase certain types of technology, they actually have to go through a public process of notice and hearing, right? So you could maybe head something off that's particularly bad, or you could scope it. And I've seen that mostly, I think, on the West Coast, and it's usually organized by the ACLU or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I feel like they actually have a toolkit you could use to sort of take and put on your local decision makers, and that might be a way to do it. Because I mean, that's always the right thing to do, right? To have public notice and hearing. There should never be a situation where they're investing a lot of money, making huge privacy decisions without that. So that might be a way to kind of cut to the chase.
Though, just to add, though the industrial IoT is less relevant to communities because it's dealing with manufacturers, the process by which we do the norm setting, thank you for the reminder, Dan. We work with a dynamic coalition on IoT at the IGF and purposely publish it more openly as we're working on it to make sure that as much input and deliberate input from all sorts of civil society, but community-oriented civil society are part of the conversation. And so while even this IoT protocol being more relevant to manufacturing and production, the process by which we're going through the governance at the World Economic Forum is intentionally inclusive and inviting to community input to the extent that it's possible and relevant.
Great. Michael.
Yeah, I kind of have a privacy question here.
You're on.
Oh, Michael Kaiser. Kind of a privacy question here. So obviously all these things work on data. Data is going to be the fuel of all smart cities. And so data is going to come from different places. And there was a recent example where some shopping malls in Southern California actually had license plate readers on. It was a private mall, right? They were collecting license plate information, and then they were sharing that information with ICE. And I think, so that's a kind of an extreme example, but I think what I see here, like we had in cybersecurity for so long, there are going to be third-party providers of data into these smart city systems. And I'm just wondering, how do we control for some of that on two fronts? One, the privacy front, but also the integrity of that data. How do you know that the data that's coming from those third parties, or even the data that's being generated from the city for that matter, still has integrity? That because there's so much of it, if the data is corrupt in any way, it changes the outcome. So, and especially when you get to the scale that we're talking about here, like one minor little glitch, putting a car, 4 feet forward into the intersection when it's not supposed to be there has a radical impact across the whole system. So how are we going to grapple with some of those bigger privacy issues?
Great question.
I can start.
Please.
So your question is actually $1 billion question. No, and not just in terms of value. Actually, that's probably one of the most popular questions that I am being asked wherever I go. Data exchange and data governance platform issue. You're absolutely right. With all this different data out there, especially the private sector companies, sometimes they own the data. And there's already a dispute between municipal governments and the companies and who actually has access to who stores the data, who owns the data, and all these kind of issues. They typically right now resolve that issue by private agreement, but that agreement framework is not universal. It's all the place. The problem eventually is this. If it is a peer-to-peer one-on-one agreement, if that's the only way to make it work, you're going to never see a hockey stick. You're going to essentially just see incremental growth. But at the other end of the story, as you mentioned, there is a lot of efforts going on right now to create some kind of data repository exchange mechanism. The reason I call it mechanism is it's a combination of technology and actual policy and governance. And there are too many. I know of at least 24 activities just in the United States to become the central source of the data exchange. And when you have that many out there, that many different frameworks out there, that means there's no standards, there's no agreement. Everybody does their own thing, which is fine for now, because that's not as much as a big issue that we are seeing today. It will come soon, and at that point, we will need some kind of accepted best practices. It may not be at the down to the code and technical level, but it has to be some kind of governance level. And the reason this is tough is because everybody wants to have their own thing, and nobody wants to use anybody's. Somebody told me that IoT and data is like a toothpaste. No,
Yeah.
I want to have my own. Is it you or somebody else? He said that.
Should have been.
I use it, and nobody wants to use anybody else's.
And once it's out of the tube, you can't put it back in.
Exactly. So hey, here's the original author of that thing. So anyway, so but that's where I think the role of, say, organizations like WEF and the role of like a NIST, for example, come in. I don't make money out of that. I'm in federal government. We don't really do that. We help the field to get to that kind of consensus. So I don't have the answer to your question, but that's the extremely important thing we all have to work together.
Right. We've got about 5 minutes. Other questions as we start to, if you have a question, sort of raise your hand.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, please.
I have a question on the resiliency aspect of these smart communities. So,
A little bit.
can you hear me? Oh,
That's
my name is
better.
Will McKnight, by the way. So I was wondering if any steps are being taken into preventing hacks on like the electricity grid, and if the entire electricity grid goes down, like 30% of the U.S. electricity grid is infected by Russian and Chinese malware right now. So I was wondering if any steps are being taken in that direction.
Part of the proposal that this IoT protocol that we're proposing is intended to address that and to try to take one part of it, the industrial sector, and to have those to have it impact and have those practices then perpetuate in other contexts. But we looked, the group, the network of experts looked at those examples that have already occurred, as I mentioned just briefly as an aside, in the Ukraine. This actually happened, not just the threat of it, but that for most of a day, last summer and 3 summers ago, the grid went down in several parts, department states of the Ukraine, and so it is a very real concern, and it's something that needs to have urgent attention. Some of the work that everyone on this stage is doing, and I'm sure many in this room as well, are trying to raise awareness of how crucial it is, and that the, as you pinpointed, the critical infrastructure impacts are enormous and exponential. So the urgency of being able to address that are important. I would also mention that there's an international law level which our IoT protocol touches, which is there is a security resolution. The UN Security Council did pass a resolution that enables governments and that places an obligation on them to find the vulnerabilities within their domestic contexts. And so there is that obligation, and it's in the process of figuring out how that's going to happen in different countries. But there is awareness there. I think you're raising an important point, a very alarming one, but that there's a lot of ideas and a lot of well-meaning work trying to address it.
And can I just add
Yeah,
something
please.
that's unnecessarily controversial too, and I'll preface it by saying CDT loves working with the private sector. And we believe there should be a slight touch, on government regulation. But that's the type of situation that is going to force the government to finally decide whether they want to avoid a catastrophic event more than they want to avoid telling the private sector what to do, right? And I don't say that's the right answer for many things, but I think bigger problems are there's actual websites out there, I can't remember what it's called, right? Where they put in actual passcodes from all the hard-coded industrial and CI operations. So as much as we want to talk about, oh my gosh, ISIS, Russia, I mean, there's literally a website with the password that you can go get now and hack into their system. If you even want to call that a hack. I mean, the situation is so bad, there's going to need to be something fundamentally different and maybe a forcing function. And if it's going to be after something catastrophic or serious happening, I don't think private industry is going to like the result of it.
I was going to make the same point from the technical standpoint. I mean, we're kind of saying we got to rethink how we do governance, how we do government regulation, but also technically, you can't secure the networks the way that you used to do it, where you think about it, and you made this point earlier, everything is so distributed now, we can't protect it like a moat around a castle anymore. We have to push out security to every device and to the, and to think about how to manage things differently and think about what needs to be connected and what shouldn't be connected. So I think, there's a lot of work happening in that area, but it's got to happen fast given the vulnerabilities.
Yep. Well, I've got one last question for the panel, but sort of to frame this. So thank you very much for your time and attention and interest in Internet of Things and smart cities. We have within IGF, we have a very active dynamic coalition on the Internet of Things. And as you see from represented on the stage, we have a diversity of stakeholders, a real multi-stakeholder process, but we welcome involvement. So see me afterward or find me on LinkedIn and be happy to get you plugged in. We've got a session at IGF in Paris. So if any of you are planning to be in Paris, but there's also other ways to contribute. So please be involved. But related to that, so what we're doing within IGF is kind of a global, voluntary policy framework. It's not technical, but it's meant to cover privacy and cybersecurity and standards. But just as sort of a quick closing thought, what are the kinds of frameworks and standards that you all believe we need to be thinking about now to sort of be bringing scale and best practices to the Internet of Things and to smart cities? So let's start with you, Eddan, and then we'll just go down.
Sure. So just to highlight again, the IoT good practices paper is up. It's been for a couple of years and is open to comment. And we've joined the Dynamic Coalition and see IGF as an important means by which to disseminate, but also invite feedback. One thing that is not dealt with as much, and it was by the specific way in which it was designed and how we went about the IoT protocol, is that there is not much of a focus on the privacy aspects because there's less of it's segmented. The privacy concerns are of a different nature when it comes to the manufacturing context than in consumer and smart cities and others. But I would say that it is most definitely in that area of some of the privacy concerns, and in particular consumer privacy, that there's a lot of room for consensus to be built and need for the vulnerabilities to be addressed.
Right.
All right. I'm going to quickly make 2 points. First, the way that we think about the cybersecurity and privacy in IoT and smart city cannot just be an extension of existing IT enterprise cybersecurity and privacy. I'll give just an example. We talked about password, and frankly, that's the bedrock of IT, enterprise IT security. Password, you change it every 3 months with the 12 digits, with the special characters, all that. If you remove that, which will happen in IoT, because you cannot assign password to each small device everywhere in the world and change it every 3 months. That's virtually impossible, all right? Then suddenly the thought process about security and privacy will going to completely change, okay? So you have to think from that perspective. Second point is adoption. I always come to this with a framework instead of any discussion. Well, writing a document by, say, 10 different players in one document is one thing. But really when it comes down to its success, it has to be about adoption. So focus on adoption. The success metric of success is not about how many pages the document is. It's about how many cities, how many companies, how many actual users and implementers adopt it and use it. That has to be the goal of success, and I hope that IGF and WF and NIST, we all work together, and even private sector like AT&T, with the goal of adoption.
And civil society. Michelle.
I would like to see a more honest conversation about privacy and what people care about, right? I don't want it to be box checking. I don't want people to go through FIPS and say, what's the big deal? I want them to just accept that people are concerned about this information and be responsive to it. And I think that's another level of detail that we can get into that might not be out there, right? There's always our placeholder for privacy, but accepting that certain types of information upset people when the government collects it, and building the controls to minimize it. Ensuring that when they issue these contracts to buy these devices, that they are demanding the control over this information so they can protect privacy when necessary.
Jeff, final word.
Yeah, I was going to just reiterate some of what Eddan said about governance and risk management, and I would say we need to push that up to higher levels where it's not a technical issue, it's not an ICT, it's a C-suite issue or the political leaders of the community issue, because these issues are too important to just leave as, my cybersecurity officer has it or my chief privacy officer has it. And I think finding a way to translate these risk management and governance issues to that non-technical higher level, which I know the Dynamic Coalition has been working on, should continue to be an area of focus.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for your time and attention. Please join me in thanking our panel.